shaped on lips that would never move again. The trade winds had stopped. Sophia noticed that first, before the blood dried on the veranda stones, before the servants scattered like mina birds flushed from a banyan. The air hung thick and sweet with the rot of cut cane, and somewhere in the stillness her mind folded itself into a strange, clean corridor where everything made sense. She had not screamed when they did it. That was the part she could not understand. Her mouth had opened. Her lungs had filled. But the sound never came, as though her body understood before she did that screaming would not rebuild what the machete had unmade. Her son had been 4 days old. Koa's eyes had found hers across the killing ground, steady and warm even at the end, and she realized he was trying to tell her something. Survive. That single syllable, shaped on lips that would never move again, etched itself behind her eyelids like scripture. So she survived. She let her mother press a cold cloth to her forehead. She let the house girls change her soiled dress. She sat in the parlor chair with her hands folded and her large pale eyes fixed on the portrait of her father above the mantel, the one painted in London before they sailed, where he stood in his colonel's uniform with his chin raised against an empire of lesser men. 3 days she sat like that, refusing food, drinking only when water was brought to her lips. The household whispered that grief had broken her. Her mother, Constance, wept privately and avoided her gaze. Her father did not visit. He had retired to his study on the second floor, satisfied that order had been restored. On the fourth morning Sophia rose, washed her face, braided her blonde hair with the patience of a woman threading a needle, and descended to the kitchen. "I will bring father his tea," she told the cook. No one questioned her. A dutiful daughter tending to her father seemed proof of recovery, of repentance. She carried the tray upstairs. The colonel sat at his desk reviewing ledgers, his graying mutton chop sideburns framing a jaw that had never unclenched. His cold blue eyes flicked toward her and then returned to his columns of numbers, sugar yields, labor costs, the arithmetic of human suffering. "Set it down," he said. She placed the cup before him. Ko had taught her which plants along the stream were medicinal and which were not. She had been a diligent student. The oleander grew wild beside the garden where she used to read her novels, its blossoms so lovely that visitors often picked them without knowing what lived inside the stems. She had boiled the leaves the night before, reducing them with the same care her father applied to his cane. He drank. "You look improved," he said without looking up. "Lord Ashford's ship arrives within the fortnight. You will compose yourself." Lord Ashford, the man she was meant to marry, a name that belonged to a life that no longer existed. "Yes, father." She returned for the cup an hour later. He complained of a headache. She brought him a second cup that evening, sweetened with honey from the plantation hives. By nightfall his hands trembled over the ledger pages and his face had gone the color of raw tallow. "Fetch the physician," he ordered. "The physician rode to Lahaina," she lied. "He will not return until morning." She sat beside him through the night, adjusting his pillow, dabbing his brow, performing every tender office a devoted daughter might. When he retched into the basin, she held it steady. When his legs cramped and he cursed the climate, the food, the incompetence of everyone around him, she murmured agreement. Toward dawn his rigid posture finally broke. He slumped against the headboard and his eyes, those terrible blue eyes that had watched a newborn dragged from its mother's arms, searched her face with something approaching understanding. "Sophia," he whispered, "what have you done?" She leaned close, close enough to smell the decay already gathering at the edges of him. "I have been patient, father, as you taught me." She pressed the damp cloth to his forehead the way her mother had pressed one to hers, "and diligent, as you demanded." His mouth worked. No sound came. She watched his silence the way he had watched hers on the veranda, and she thought of Koa's steady gaze and the word it carried. The colonel died as the sun broke over the cane fields, gilding the leaves in copper and gold. Sophia closed his eyes, smoothed the ledger shut, and walked to the lanai. Below, the laborers were already filing toward the fields, their dark shoulders bent under a sky so blue it hurt. She breathed the trade winds as they returned at last, carrying the scent of plumeria and salt. In the garden her novels lay where she had left them weeks ago, their pages curled by humidity. She would not read them again. The stories she needed now were not written in any book. She descended the stairs, passed her weeping mother without a word, and stepped into the morning light, her bare feet on red Hawaiian earth, a woman with nothing left to lose and therefore nothing left to fear. They buried Colonel Aldrich Whitworth on the hill behind the chapel, beneath a plumeria tree whose white blossoms fell like small surrenders onto the freshly turned earth. The minister read from Ecclesiastes. Constance wore black taffeta and wept into a handkerchief embroidered with her husband's initials. Sophia stood apart, dry-eyed, watching the wooden casket descend into Hawaiian soil that had never asked for English bones. 3 weeks passed. The plantation continued its rhythms. The overseers cracked their orders. The cane grew tall and indifferent. Constance assumed command of the household ledgers with a competence that surprised no one who had watched her silently manage the colonel's affairs for 20 years. She did not speak of Koa. She did not speak of the child. She moved through the house like a woman wading through water, each step deliberate, each word measured against the threat of drowning. Sophia waited. She had expected relief. She had expected the clean silence that follows a storm, the way the air smells after lightning has burned through it. Instead, she found something worse than grief, worse than rage. She found that the killing had not been enough. The colonel was dead, but his order persisted. His ledgers still governed the fields. His name still hung above the estate like a commandment. The laborers still bent their backs under the same sky, and Koa's body had been thrown into an unmarked trench near the stream where he had once taught her the names of healing plants. No marker, no prayer, as though he had never existed. And her son who had breathed for 4 days in a world that would not have him. Sophia understood then that poison had been too gentle, too invisible. The colonel had died in his bed with a damp cloth on his brow, and his daughter's face the last thing he saw, and it looked to the world like fever, like the climate's indifference. There had been no reckoning. No mirror held up to his cruelty. He had escaped into the dignity of a Christian burial, and the earth held him like a secret she could not bear to keep. She went on the night of the new moon, when the darkness was absolute and the trade winds carried the sound of the sea over every other noise. She took the shovel from the garden shed and climbed the hill barefoot, her white cotton shift bright against the volcanic earth. The plumeria blossoms had wilted on the grave. She brushed them aside and began to dig. The soil was loose, freshly turned, and yielded easily. She worked with the patience he had taught her, each shovelful deliberate, each motion controlled. Her arms burned. Her palms blistered and then tore. She did not stop. Diligence, the colonel had always said, separates the civilized from the savage. She had learned his lessons better than he knew. When the shovel struck wood, she knelt and clawed the remaining dirt away with her fingers. The casket lid groaned open. The smell rose to meet her, sweet and thick, a corruption that matched the one he had planted in her life. She looked down at the gray face, the rigid jaw now slack, the mutton-chop sideburns matted with grave soil, and she felt nothing but the certainty that he needed to see what he had made of her. She raised the shovel high. The blade caught no moonlight because there was none. She brought it down with the full weight of every silent scream, and the sound it made was not the sound she expected. It was quieter, duller, like cutting through cane. She struck again, and again, until the thing was done. She lifted his head by the hair and held it at arm's length, and she was still holding it when the lantern appeared at the top of the hill, and her mother's voice shattered the silence. "Sophia, oh dear God, Sophia." Constance stood frozen, the lantern trembling in her hand, its amber light painting the open grave in shapes that would never leave her mind. Her mouth opened and closed. She took one step forward and then another, as though approaching a wild animal. "Put it down," Constance whispered. "Put it down and come inside. We can still fix this. No one has to know. No one has to know." The same words Constance had used when the colonel ordered Koa killed. The same words she had whispered while Sophia bled and screamed in the upstairs bedroom and her son was carried away. No one has to know. The family creed. The doctrine of buried things. Sophia swung the shovel with one hand. The flat of the blade connected with Constance's temple, and her mother folded silently onto the grass, the lantern rolling and guttering, but not going out. Sophia watched her fall with the same detached clarity she had felt on the veranda when the world first broke. She set down her father's head. She lifted her mother under the arms and dragged her down the hill, across the yard, past the sleeping quarters and the cane press, to the meat shed where the plantation's cattle were butchered and hung. The building smelled of iron and salt. Hooks lined the ceiling. A heavy cleaver rested on the block where the cook broke down carcasses each Friday. She propped Constance against the wall and returned for the head. When she came back, her mother was stirring, a dark line of blood running from her temple into her silver hair. Sophia placed the colonel's head on the block, facing outward, his dead eyes aimed at the woman he had married 30 years ago in a Sussex chapel. "He should see this," Sophia said quietly. "He should see what his family becomes." Constance's eyes focused. She saw the head. She saw her daughter standing over her with the cleaver, still wearing the white shift now streaked with grave dirt and worse. She opened her mouth, but Sophia spoke first. "You held the lantern for them, Mother, when they came for Koa. You stood on the veranda and held the lantern so they could see where to cut." Her voice was level, almost tender. "You said nothing when they took my son from my arms. You pressed a cloth to my forehead and you said no one has to know." Constance began to weep. "I was trying to protect you." "You were protecting him." Sophia nodded toward the head on the block. "You were always protecting him." She raised the cleaver. The first stroke opened her mother's shoulder to the bone, and Constance's scream was the sound Sophia herself had never been able to make, released now through another's throat, filling the meat shed, rising through the rafters into the Hawaiian night where the trade winds carried it out over the cane fields and the sea, and the unmarked grave by the stream where Koa lay unhearing. Sophia worked with patience. She worked with diligence. She kept her father's face turned toward her mother's so that his dead eyes could witness every stroke, every tremor, every wet and failing breath. She whispered to him as she worked. "Are you watching, Father? Are you satisfied that order has been restored?" When it was finished, she sat on the floor of the meat shed between what remained of her parents and listened to the silence. The trade winds blew. The cane rustled. Somewhere a night bird called and received no answer. She washed her hands in the trough outside, braided her hair with steady fingers, and walked barefoot across the red earth to the garden where her novels still lay curling in the humidity. She did not pick them up. She continued past them, down the path to the stream, to the unmarked place where the soil was slightly sunken. She knelt and pressed her palms flat against the earth. "I survived," she told him, "the way you asked me to." The wind answered, warm, steady, carrying plumeria and salt. She closed her eyes and breathed it in, and when she opened them the sky was beginning to lighten in the east, copper and gold spreading over the cane fields like a promise she no longer believed but could not stop watching. Sophia's sisters arrived on the same schooner, 10 days after the burial of their mother was announced by letter. Alina came first down the gangplank, 23, and rigid with propriety, her mourning dress buttoned to the throat despite the heat. Behind her came Violet, 17, clutching a parasol she had not yet learned to hold with authority. She had their mother's silver blonde hair and their father's blue eyes, and when she embraced Sophia on the dock her body trembled with what Sophia mistook for grief. The story Sophia had constructed held together like good stitching. The colonel had died of tropical fever. Constance, overcome, had wandered from the house in a delirium and fallen from the sea cliffs 2 miles east. The body was never recovered. The overseers accepted it. The minister accepted it. Alina accepted it with the particular credulity of a woman who had spent 6 years in a London finishing school learning not to ask uncomfortable questions. Violet said very little. The mourning period observed its rituals. Black crepe over the mirrors. Curtains drawn against the insistent Hawaiian sun. Alina reorganized the household accounts with the same brittle efficiency their mother had possessed, and Sophia let her, watching from doorways, barefoot on the cool Koa wood floors. She had scrubbed the meat shed 3 times with lye water and vinegar. She had buried most of what needed burying, but her father's head she had kept, wrapped in oilcloth and placed in the wooden salt box at the back of the shed, behind the curring hooks where no one had reason to look. She could not explain why she kept it, only that disposing of it felt like releasing him from a sentence he had not yet finished serving. Lord Ashford's ship was expected Thursday. Alina threw herself into preparation with the devotion of a woman building a cathedral. Linens were aired. Silver was polished. The cook was instructed to prepare a reception that would make the plantation appear governed rather than grieving. "He will want to see competence," Alina said at breakfast, spreading guava jam on bread she barely touched. "A man like Ashford does not marry into chaos." "He is not marrying you," Sophia said. Alina's knife paused. "No, he is marrying you, which is precisely why you should put on shoes." Sophia looked at her bare feet, at the red earth still caught beneath her toenails despite weeks of washing. She smiled. Alina looked away. Violet had been disappearing. Sophia noticed it the way she noticed everything now, with the quiet cataloging attention of a woman who had learned that survival depended on seeing what others preferred to hide. Violet slipped from her room after the household retired. She returned before dawn with grass stains on her hem, and a flush that had nothing to do with the climate. On the second night, Sophia followed her as far as the cane press before losing her in the dark, and she stood there listening to the wind move through the stalks, and feeling something cold settle behind her sternum. Thursday came wrapped in clouds. The schooner appeared at noon, a dark shape against the gray water, and Lord Ashford descended onto Hawaiian soil with the confidence of a man who believed the world had been arranged for his comfort. He was tall, fair-haired, younger than Sophia had expected. His handshake was firm. His eyes moved over the plantation with the appraising hunger of a buyer examining livestock. "Miss Whitworth." He took Sophia's hand and held it a moment too long. "My deepest condolences. Your father was a man of extraordinary vision." "He was," Sophia said. "He saw exactly what he wanted to see." Ashford smiled as though she had paid a compliment. Behind him, Violet stood on the veranda with her hands clasped, and Sophia saw it then, the way Ashford's gaze slid past her and landed on her youngest sister with a recognition that preceded introduction. The way Violet's fingers tightened on each other. The way neither of them looked at the other for the rest of the afternoon, which was the surest sign that they had already learned each other's faces in the dark. They know each other. The thought arrived without surprise. Sophia poured tea and passed sandwiches and watched the geometry of their avoidance with the same patience she had applied to the oleander reduction, and to the digging, and to everything that followed. That evening she excused herself early, claiming headache. She climbed the stairs, closed her bedroom door, opened the window, and waited. The house settled into silence. Aliner's lamp went out at 10. At 11:30 Sophia heard the creak of Violet's door, the whisper of bare feet on the stairs, the soft click of the kitchen latch. She counted to 60, then she followed. The path to the meat shed was silver under a half-moon. Sophia moved along it without sound, her feet knowing every root and stone. She heard them before she saw them, low voices tangled together, and then a laugh, Violet's laugh, bright and careless in a way that made something fracture behind Sophia's eyes. She was 10 yards from the door when Violet screamed. The sound split the night like the cleaver had split bone. Sophia broke into a run and reached the doorway in time to see Violet stumbling backward from the salt box, the oilcloth unwrapped on the floor, and her father's head exposed in the lamplight, gray and collapsed and unmistakable. Ashford stood behind Violet with his shirt half unbuttoned, his face the color of tallow. "What in God's name?" he breathed. Violet turned and saw Sophia in the doorway. Her mouth shaped words that did not come. Her eyes, their father's eyes, widened with an understanding that arrived too late. Sophia reached for the cleaver on the block. It was where she had left it. She had cleaned it, oiled it, hung it back on its nail, and now it fit her hand like a thing that had been waiting. "Sophia, listen to me." Ashford raised both palms. "We can discuss this. Whatever has happened here, we can find a civilized resolution." Civilized. The word opened a door in her mind, and behind it she heard the colonel's voice, calm and instructive, the way it sounded when he explained to her at age 6 why certain people were born to cut cane and others to own it. "Diligence, Sophia. Patience. These are the virtues that separate us." "You are right, Lord Ashford," she said. Her voice sounded distant to her own ears, as if she were speaking from the bottom of the stream where Koa lay. "We should be civilized about this." She closed the door behind her. The latch fell with a small iron sound. Violet pressed herself against the far wall. Ashford stepped in front of her, some reflex of chivalry surfacing despite his terror. Sophia watched them with her head tilted slightly, the way one watches birds settle on a branch, and she realized she could hear Koa's voice beneath the wind. Not words exactly, but a low hum, the melody he used to sing while stripping cane, and it filled the spaces between her thoughts until the thoughts themselves dissolved, and there was only the hum and the cleaver and the amber light making long shadows of them all. "Family," she whispered, and she was no longer certain whether she was speaking to them or to the severed head watching from the salt box with its soul-crusted eyes. "This is what family does. It keeps its secrets." She stepped forward. The cleaver rose and fell twice before Ashford could lower his hands. The first stroke opened his forearm to the bone where he tried to shield Violet. The second caught him across the throat, and he folded forward with a sound like wind leaving a sail, his blood striking the packed earth floor in a pattern that reminded Sophia of the hibiscus petals Koa used to press between the pages of her novels. Violet did not run. She stood against the wall with her father's blue eyes wide and unblinking, watching Ashford collapse, watching the lamplight catch the wet edge of the blade, and when Sophia turned to face her, she whispered the only honest thing she had said since arriving on the island. "He was going to take me away from here. That was all. That was all we wanted." "Everyone wants to leave," Sophia said. "No one asks the cane." She was patient. She was diligent. When it was over, she sat between the three bodies, her parents' remains and now these two, and she listened to the silence the way one listens to the space between waves, waiting for the next one to arrive. The colonel's head watched from the salt box. She met his gaze. Two more for your ledger, father. She worked through the pre-dawn hours with the butchering tools that hung from the ceiling hooks, her hands steady, her mind somewhere above her body, where the hum of Koa's melody carried her like a current. She separated what could be used from what could not. She wrapped the usable flesh in cheesecloth and packed it in salt alongside the pork stores. The rest she carried in canvas sacks down to the stream, past Koa's unmarked grave, to the place where the volcanic rock formed a deep channel and the current ran fast toward the sea. She weighted the sacks with stones and watched them sink. By the time the sun crested the eastern ridge, she had scrubbed the shed floor with lye for the fourth time in a month. Her arms no longer shook, her hands no longer blistered. The body learns what it must. She told Elena at breakfast that Ashford had departed on an early tide, called back to London by urgent business, and that Violet had gone with him. Elena set down her teacup. Gone with him, without a word. They were lovers, Elena, had been for months. I found them in the shed last night. Violet wept and begged me not to tell you. They left before dawn. Elena's face hardened into a mask that might have been their mother's. Then, she has ruined herself. Yes, Sophia said, she has. Elena retreated to the study to compose letters of outrage to relatives who would never receive them, and Sophia walked the perimeter of the estate with the unhurried gait of a woman surveying her kingdom. She passed the cane press, the drying sheds, the long low barracks where the laborers slept in rows. She passed the overseer's cottage where Foreman Briggs kept his office and his whip collection mounted on the wall like trophies. She heard the girl before she saw her. The sound came from behind the molasses house, a low, broken keening that Sophia recognized because she had made it herself in the upstairs bedroom while her son was carried away. She rounded the corner and stopped. Sasha, one of the Kanaka women who worked the boiling house, was crouched against the wall with her shift torn open and her lips split. Standing over her, fastening his belt, was Foreman Briggs. He did not see Sophia. He spat onto the ground beside Sasha's hip and said something in a voice too low to carry. Sophia stepped back behind the wall. She pressed her spine against the rough timber and closed her eyes, and behind her lids she saw the lantern on the veranda, her mother's steady hand, the machete rising in the cane field. The geometry was always the same. The strong took from the weak, and someone held the light so they could see where to cut. Survive, Ko had mouthed, but survival alone was no longer sufficient. She waited until Briggs was gone. She knelt beside Sasha and pressed a damp cloth to the girl's mouth with a gentleness she had not used since holding her son. Sasha flinched. No one has to know, Sophia whispered, and the words tasted like ash, and she understood at last why her mother had said them. Not from cruelty, but from cowardice. From the belief that silence could contain what had already spilled. Sophia was done with containment. She spent 2 days in the kitchen. She rendered the salted flesh with suet and onion, folded it into pastry shells with sweet potato, and ginger the way the cook prepared the Friday pies. She worked alone, dismissing the kitchen staff to assist Elena with the fabricated correspondence. Into the filling, she stirred a reduction she had been cultivating since the colonel's death. Oleander concentrate, thickened with cane syrup, until it disappeared into the spiced gravy like a prayer dissolving into wind. On Saturday evening, she set the long table in the plantation house dining room with her mother's wedding china and her father's crystal. She placed a red hibiscus blossom at each setting. She invited all 6 foremen and both overseers, framing the dinner as a gesture of gratitude for their service during the family's bereavement. Elena, delighted by any return to propriety, presided at the far end of the table and praised the crust. Briggs sat to Sophia's left. He ate with the indiscriminate appetite of a man who had never questioned what was placed before him. The others followed. They drank the colonel's brandy. They toasted his memory. Sophia did not eat. She watched them chew. She watched the gravy stain their lips, and she thought of Sasha's split mouth, of Koa's steady hands, of the 4 days her son had breathed. The first man doubled over before dessert was cleared. Then another. Briggs clutched the tablecloth and pulled the china crashing to the floor as his legs gave way. Elena stood, her chair scraping, her face white. Sophia, what is happening, Sophia? Sophia rose from her chair and walked to the head of the table where her father had once sat carving meat. She looked down the length of the dining room at the men writhing on the floor, and the overturned crystal and the red hibiscus blossoms scattered among the wreckage. and she felt the wind from the open windows move through her hair, warm, carrying plumeria and salt, carrying the melody that never stopped. "Family dinner," she said softly. Alina backed toward the door. Sophia let her go. She stood at the head of the table until every man was still, and then she collected the red blossoms one by one and carried them down the hill to the stream, to the unmarked grave, and pressed them into the earth above the place where Koa slept. The plantation was silent. The cane stood tall and indifferent. Somewhere beyond the reef the sea moved with a patience older than empires, and Sophia Whitworth, barefoot and alone and covered in the quiet aftermath of everything she had become, knelt in the red Hawaiian dirt and whispered the only word that still meant anything: survive. Alina Whitworth had always believed in ledgers, in columns that balanced, in figures that told the truth even when people would not. She sat in her father's study with the plantation's death register open before her and a cup of tea growing cold at her elbow, and she counted the names: Foreman Briggs, Overseer Calloway, Overseer Pratt, 4 junior foremen whose surnames she still confused, the cook's boy who had eaten scraps from the feast, 9 dead in a single evening, and the doctor from Lahaina had ridden out the next morning, examined the bodies, and written oleander poisoning, likely contaminated water supply in his report with the weary penmanship of a man who had seen too many plantation deaths to investigate any of them thoroughly. That had been 5 weeks ago. Alina had accepted the explanation because accepting explanations was what she did. She had been educated for it, trained in the London parlors where young women learned to smile at answers that made no sense and never, under any circumstances, to dig. But the deaths had not stopped. 2 laborers collapsed in the boiling house last Tuesday. A stable hand was found face down in the irrigation ditch on Thursday, his skin mottled with the same livid blotching she had seen on Briggs as he clawed the tablecloth from the dining table. Yesterday the new foreman, a man called Hale whom Alina had hired from the Dawson estate 3 miles east, failed to appear for morning muster. They found him in the drying shed with his eyes open, and his mouth stained with something dark and sweet. 12 dead. Alina wrote the number at the bottom of the column and underlined it twice. She closed the ledger and pressed her fingertips against her eyelids until she saw white. Through the study window, the cane fields stretched toward the mountains in long green rows, orderly, indifferent, as though the earth itself had no opinion about what grew from it or what was buried beneath. She could hear the remaining laborers singing as they worked, a low Hawaiian chant whose words she had never learned, and whose melody settled into her chest like homesickness for a place she had never belonged. Sophia was in the garden. Alina watched her through the glass. Her sister knelt among the flower beds in her white cotton shift, barefoot as always, her blonde hair loose and tangled with petals. She was transplanting something from a clay pot into the dark volcanic soil, her hands steady, her movements unhurried. She looked like a painting. She looked like their mother had looked tending roses in Sussex, before Hawaii, before everything. Alina felt the comparison form and then crack apart, because their mother was dead at the bottom of a sea cliff, and Violet had eloped with Lord Ashford, and their father lay beneath the plumeria tree on the hill, and somehow Sophia alone remained, kneeling in the dirt planting things. "You are staring again." Alina startled. Sophia had not looked up. Her fingers continued pressing soil around the base of the new plant, a low shrub with waxy dark leaves that Alina did not recognize. "I was admiring your garden," Alina said through the open window. "It admires you back." Sophia glanced up and smiled, and the smile was the same one she had worn at 12 years old when she brought Alina a birthday nosegay, sweet and guileless, and Alina felt something loosen in her chest despite herself. "Come outside. You have been in that study since dawn." "Someone must manage the accounts. We have lost another foreman." Sophia's hands paused for a fraction of a second, then resumed their work. "Hale. Found this morning, same symptoms as the others." "The water," Sophia said quietly. "The doctor said the aquifer runs through Oleander Grove's uphill. It poisons itself." "Oleander does not explain a man dying in a locked shed with a cup of cane syrup in his hand, Sophia." Sophia sat back on her heels and looked at Alina with those pale eyes, large and unreadable, and Alina thought of their father's eyes, which had been blue and certain, and their mother's, which had been gray and evasive, and she realized Sophia's were neither. They were the color of light passing through shallow water, and what lay beneath them she could not see. "What are you suggesting?" Sophia asked. "I am not suggesting anything. I am observing that 12 people have died on this plantation in 5 weeks, and the doctor's explanation does not account for it. People die here, Alina. They have always died here. Father's ledgers are full of it. Laborers taken by heat, by infection, by the machinery. You simply were not here to count them. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Alina opened her mouth and closed it. Sophia returned to her planting, and the conversation was over in the way Sophia ended all conversations now, not with argument but with a silence so complete it felt like a door shutting. Alina withdrew from the window. She stood in the study surrounded by her father's maps and her mother's embroidered cushions, and the faint, persistent smell of pipe tobacco that would not leave the curtains, and she made a decision that no finishing school had prepared her for. She would investigate. She began that afternoon in the kitchen, where the new cook, a Hawaiian woman named Leilani, was preparing the evening meal. Alina examined the water barrels, the sugar stores, the salt boxes. She opened every tin and jar and held them to the light. She found nothing unusual. She moved to the storeroom, then the pantry, then the cellar where the colonel's brandy collected dust. She worked with the meticulous patience her father had demanded of his officers, and her mother had demanded of her needlework, and she found nothing, and the nothing frightened her more than evidence would have. That night she could not sleep. She lay in her narrow bed listening to the house breathe around her, the creak of cooling timber, the scratch of geckos on the walls, the wind threading through the jalousie shutters. At midnight she heard Sophia's door open. Alina held her breath, bare feet on the stairs, the kitchen latch, then silence. She rose and went to the window. In the moonlight she saw her sister crossing the yard toward the garden, carrying a lantern in one hand and a basket in the other. Sophia knelt among the flower beds and began to harvest, cutting leaves and stems with a small knife, working with the focused deliberation of a woman performing surgery. The lantern threw her shadow long across the red earth, and Alina watched from above, counting the plants her sister touched, memorizing their shapes against the dark soil, and feeling the first cold thread of understanding begin to wind itself around her throat. Alina spent 3 days in the study with a borrowed botanical atlas propped against the plantation ledger, cross-referencing the shapes she had memorized from Sophia's midnight harvest against every plate and engraving in the volume. The atlas had belonged to their mother, one of the few books Constance had brought from England, its margins annotated in her careful feminine hand with the Latin names of island flora. Alina worked through it page by page, her tea untouched, her morning dress buttoned so tightly at the throat she could feel her own pulse beating against the whalebone collar. On the second day she found the first match. The low shrub with waxy dark leaves that Sophia had transplanted was Cerbera manghas, the suicide tree, whose seeds contained a cardiac poison so potent that a single kernel, ground and mixed with food, could stop a man's heart within hours. The symptoms described in the atlas matched what she had seen in Briggs: convulsions, livid skin, a mouth twisted open as though trying to expel something that had already reached the blood. On the third day she identified 2 more: a bruise precatorius, the rosary pea, whose scarlet seeds lined the garden path like ornamental beads, and a climbing vine she had mistaken for morning glory, which the atlas named Gelsemium elegans, yellow jasmine, lethal in every part from root to flower. Alina closed the book and sat very still. Through the window Sophia was watering her beds with a tin can, humming a melody Alina had heard the laborers sing, something Hawaiian and low and aching. The tune drifted through the glass and settled in the room like smoke. She thought of the locked shed, the cup of cane syrup in Hale's hand. She thought of the livid blotching on the stable hand's skin. She thought of her sister's fingers pressing dark soil around the roots of a tree that existed for no purpose but to kill. Then she thought of Violet. The story had been simple. Lord Ashford arrived, fell in love with the younger Whitworth sister, and the two eloped before the month was out. Sophia had delivered the news with a sad half-smile, and a folded note she claimed Violet had left on the kitchen table. Alina had read it twice, noted that the handwriting was slightly uneven, attributed it to haste, and filed it in the drawer with the other correspondence. She had not questioned it because questioning meant imagining an alternative, and every alternative was worse. But that evening, searching the house for a replacement inkwell, Alina opened the linen closet on the upstairs landing and found Violet's pearl-handled hairbrush sitting on the middle shelf beside a stack of pressed sheets. Violet had been vain about that brush. She had carried it from London to Honolulu in a velvet pouch, and would not have left it behind for any man, Not even Ashford with his title and his bay rum cologne. Eleanor held the brush under the lamp and pulled a single auburn hair from its bristles. She wound it around her finger and felt the thread of understanding tighten another turn. The next morning she waited until Sophia disappeared into the cane fields, carrying cuttings to some purpose Eleanor did not want to imagine. Then she searched. She began methodically, room by room, the way she audited accounts. She opened every wardrobe, every chest, every drawer. She found nothing in the house. She moved to the outbuildings, the sugar mill, the boiling house, the cooperage. Nothing. She stood in the yard with the sun pressing down on her black dress and looked at the meat shed. It sat at the far edge of the compound, a low stone building with a heavy door that Sophia kept padlocked. The key, Sophia had explained, prevented the feral dogs from getting at the salted stores. Eleanor had never had reason to doubt this. She had never had reason to enter. Now she walked to the door and found it locked, as expected, and she fetched the fire iron from the kitchen hearth and broke the hasp with 3 measured blows that echoed off the mountain. The smell hit her first. Salt and copper and something deeper, sweeter, organic. Flies circled in the shaft of light that fell through the open door. The shed was cool and dim, its stone walls lined with shelves of earthenware crocks and burlap sacks. Hooks hung from the ceiling beams, empty now, though dark stains trailed down their iron curves. Violet's travel trunk sat against the far wall. Eleanor recognized it instantly. Their mother had commissioned matching trunks for each daughter before the voyage, brass-cornered leather with their initials stamped in gold. This one read V. Lay. W. Eleanor knelt and unlatched the clasps. Inside lay Violet's clothing, neatly folded. Her blue silk day dress. Her kid gloves. Her journal, its ribbon bookmark still marking an entry, dated the week she arrived. A woman who elopes takes her trunk. A woman who elopes takes her gloves. A woman who elopes does not leave her entire life, folded in a shed that smells of blood. Eleanor's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed through her nose and tasted salt. She looked at the shelves, at the crocks, at the large wooden box in the corner, the kind used for preserving pork in brine. She told herself not to open it. She told herself that whatever was inside would be the end of something she could not rebuild. She told herself that there were still explanations, that Violet might have left her trunk, that the stains might be from butchered hogs, that her sister who planted flowers and hummed in the sunlight was not what the evidence was assembling her to be. She opened the salt box. Colonel Whitworth's face stared up at her from a bed of coarse gray crystals. The salt had drawn the moisture from his skin and preserved him in a terrible approximation of life, his features shrunken and leather-dark, his mouth pulled back from his teeth, his eyes collapsed into hollow sockets that still seemed to fix her with the imperious displeasure she remembered from childhood. His beard had continued to grow for a time after death, giving him a ragged appearance that would have horrified the man who had once demanded his officers shave before dawn. Eleanor did not scream. She closed the lid. She stood. She walked outside into the blinding sunlight and vomited into the red earth beside Sophia's garden, where the rosary peas gleamed like drops of blood among the green. When she straightened, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand in a gesture no finishing school would have sanctioned, she saw that Sophia had returned. Her sister stood at the edge of the flower beds, barefoot, her white shift streaked with soil, a bundle of fresh cuttings in her arms. The wind moved through her loose blonde hair and carried with it that low Hawaiian melody. Though whether Sophia was humming, or whether the sound rose from the cane fields or from somewhere deeper, Eleanor could not tell. Sophia looked at the broken hasp on the shed door. She looked at Eleanor's stained hands. She looked at Eleanor's face, and her pale, watercolored eyes held no surprise, no alarm, only a patient and terrible recognition, as though she had been waiting for this moment the way she waited for her plants to bloom, with the quiet certainty that all things arrive in their season. "You opened the box," Sophia said. It was not a question. Eleanor stood in the yard between the garden and the shed, between the sister she had known and the thing her sister had become, and felt the last seam of her propriety split open like a husk. The sun beat down. The cane rustled. Somewhere beyond the fields, in the direction of the unmarked grave by the stream, the wind carried a melody she was only now beginning to hear. Eleanor woke to the smell of salt and iron, and the low drone of flies orbiting in darkness. Her skull throbbed where the blow had landed, a dull planetary ache that radiated from behind her left ear down through her jaw and into the roots of her teeth. She tried to raise a hand and found she could not. Coarse rope circled her wrists behind her back, knotted with the same careful precision Sophia applied to staking tomato vines. Her ankles were bound to the legs of the chair, a heavy wooden thing she recognized from the kitchen. The bindings were tight but not cruel. They did not cut. They simply held. The shed door was closed. A single tallow candle burned on the shelf to her right, its flame bending and recovering in a draft she could not feel. Shadows stretched across the stone walls, across the crocks of salt, across the empty hooks overhead, and across the open trunk that sat 2 feet in front of her. The colonel's head had been placed on the trunk lid. It faced her. The collapsed sockets and the drawn leather skin and the overgrown beard and that expression, that permanent offended snarl, as though even in this diminished state he found her posture unacceptable. The salt crystals still clung to his temples like a frost that would not melt. Alina's breath came in short pulls. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, the head was still there, and Sophia was sitting on an upturned crate against the far wall, watching her with the patience of someone tending a slow-growing seed. "You fainted after I caught you," Sophia said. "I didn't hit you hard. I used the flat side of the trowel. I'm sorry about that." Her voice was conversational. She held a damp cloth in one hand and a bowl of water in her lap. She rose, crossed the short distance, and began wiping the dried vomit from Alina's chin with small, deliberate strokes. The cloth was warm. It smelled of chamomile. "I need you to listen," Sophia said. "Not as an accountant, not as an eldest daughter, just as my sister." Alina's gaze slid to the head. Sophia followed it. "Yes, that's father. He's been there since before you arrived." She rinsed the cloth in the bowl and wrung it between her thin fingers. "I killed him with oleander reduction in his evening brandy. It took most of the night. I sat with him while it happened. He asked me to fetch the doctor, and I told him the doctor was coming, and then I told him the doctor was delayed, and then I stopped telling him anything at all." Sophia dabbed at Alina's temple where a bruise was forming. The candlelight caught her pale eyes and made them almost translucent. "There was a man named Koa. A laborer. Father brought him from his village when he was 14. She paused and tilted her head, as though listening for something beyond the walls. The wind moved through the cane and carried a low melody that entered the shed like a presence. "I loved him. We had a son. 4 days old. Father found out and had them both killed. Koa by machete in the upper field. Our baby by a pillow in the nursery, held down by Briggs while mother watched from the doorway and said nothing." The cloth moved across Alina's cheek. Sophia's hand was steady. "Mother fell from no cliff, Alina. I took the cleaver to her in the kitchen because she stood in that doorway and she chose silence. She chose propriety over a child's breath." Alina heard herself make a sound. It was not a word. It was the noise a structure makes when the central beam gives way. Violet and Ashford found the head. They came into this shed together because they were lovers and needed somewhere private, and they opened the box and they saw him. Sophia set the cloth down and smoothed a strand of dark hair from Alina's forehead with a tenderness that was worse than violence. "I couldn't let them leave with that knowledge, so I didn't." The flies droned, the candle bent. The overseers, the foremen, every man at that feast. Briggs held my son down. Hale dug the unmarked grave. Mitchell dragged Koa's body to the stream like a carcass. They all participated. They all knew. The plantation ran on silence and I broke it. Sophia knelt before her sister. Their faces were level now, inches apart. Alina could see the filaments of gold in Sophia's loose hair, the garden soil beneath her nails, the freckles across her nose from too much sun. She looked young. She looked like a girl who should be pressing flowers in a book. 12 more since the feast, the replacement men. I've been patient with them. I've watched to see if they are different. They are not different, Alina. They beat the workers. They take the women into the cane rows. They are the same machine wearing new skin. Sophia lifted the colonel's head from the trunk and held it between them like an object lesson. A lantern illuminating nothing but its own ruin. "This is what empire looks like when you strip the uniform off. Salt and rot and teeth. I keep him here so I remember what I'm dismantling." She set the head back down and returned to the cloth, now wiping Alina's wrists where the rope had reddened the skin. "I don't want to kill you. You are the only Whitworth who never held someone down or looked away while someone else did. You were at your school in London. You were learning penmanship and deportment while our family built itself on bones." Alina found her voice. It came out as a whisper scraped raw. "You cannot keep killing. I can stop when the system stops. when there is no one left who profits from the lash. That is not how order works. Order, Sophia said the word as though tasting it. Order is what they called it when they buried Koa without a name. Silence. The candle flame steadied. Beyond the shed the wind carried that melody again, low and aching and impossible, and Alina realized she had been hearing it for weeks without knowing what it was. Sophia untied the ropes. The coils fell away from Alina's wrists and ankles and lay on the stone floor like shed skins. Sophia stepped back and stood beside the open door. Outside, the garden waited in the moonlight, the rosary peas gleaming red, the suicide tree spreading its dark waxy canopy, the red hibiscus nodding beside the path that led to the unmarked grave by the stream. The road to Honolulu is clear tonight, Sophia said. You can take the horse and be at the harbor by dawn. There is a ship to San Francisco on Thursday. I've already checked. She paused. Or you can stay, not to kill. I would never ask that of you, but someone needs to keep the ledger. Someone needs to document what was done here and what is being undone. You are the most diligent person I have ever known, Alina. Diligence is its own kind of love. Alina stood. Her legs trembled. She looked at the trunk, at the head, at the garden through the door, at her sister standing barefoot on the threshold with soil on her shift and moonlight in her hair, and the calm of someone who had passed through every fire and come out the other side as something the world did not yet have a name for. She thought of ledgers. She thought of Koa's unmarked grave. She thought of Violet's hairbrush and her mother's silence and the 4-day-old child whose name she did not even know. Alina sat back down in the chair. She held out her hand. Tell me his name, she said. The baby. Tell me his name so I can write it in the book. Sophia's eyes filled for the first time. The wind carried the melody through the open door, through the garden, through the cane, and it sounded like a man humming to his son. Sophia took her sister's hand. Makoa, she whispered. It means fearless. Alina nodded once and held the name in her mouth like a seed. Outside, the red hibiscus trembled in the warm island wind, and the garden grew.